The guard put his hand on the old man's chest. "Sir, visiting hours ended at 8. You need to leave." The old man was perhaps 80, perhaps older. A worn grey coat over a plain shirt, no tie, shoes that had been good once and were now simply old. He was carrying nothing, no flowers, no bag, no anything. Just himself, standing at the entrance of Kellerman Memorial Hospital at 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in November, trying to get through the door. "I'm not visiting," the old man said. "I need to come in." "Sir, I understand, but I built this hospital." The guard looked at him, at the worn coat, at the shoes, at the man who looked, in every visible way, like someone who needed the hospital rather than someone who had built it. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step back." He put both hands on the old man's shoulders and guided him backward, 2 steps, away from the entrance. That was when the doors opened behind him. A nurse came through at a run. She was shouting before she was fully through the door. One word, a name, not a medical term, not a code, a name, his name, the name of the man in the worn grey coat, said in the voice of someone who has just seen something they are terrified has already happened. The guard turned. The old man was still standing where he had been guided to, still upright. But something in his colour had changed in the last 30 seconds, and his right hand was pressed to his chest, and his breathing was the specific shallow breathing of someone whose body is doing something their face is trying not to show. The nurse pushed past the guard and took the old man's arm with both hands. She said his name again. Quieter this time. The way you say a name when you need to know the person can still hear it. He said, "I think I waited a little too long." What happened in the next 4 hours would be described in the hospital's own records as a critical intervention in an acute cardiac event. What happened in the 4 hours after that would be described by the staff who were there as the night they learned who had been standing at their front door. And the security guard who had put his hands on the old man's shoulders and guided him back 2 steps would spend the rest of his career and the rest of his life asking himself what would have happened if the nurse had been 30 seconds later. Who was the old man in the worn grey coat? And why had he come to the hospital he built alone at night without telling anyone? Drop your city in the comments. And if you believe that some people carry everything quietly until the very last moment, subscribe. Because what the staff of Kellerman Memorial learned that night changed how they looked at every person who came through their doors. Kellerman Memorial Hospital had been built in 1971. Not the building that currently stood. That building had been through 3 major expansions and 2 complete wing additions and bore only a structural relationship to the original construction. But the institution, the specific combination of mission and practice and culture that made Kellerman Memorial what it was, had been built in 1971 by a man named Dr. Arthur Henley, who had been 31 years old at the time, and who had spent the preceding 6 years working in a series of hospitals that he had found, collectively, to be doing medicine correctly in the technical sense and incorrectly in every other sense. He had been specific about what he meant. The technical medicine was fine, the diagnosis, the treatment, the procedures. What was wrong was everything around the technical medicine, the way patients were processed rather than received, the way families were managed rather than supported, the way the institution protected itself from the human reality of what it was doing rather than accepting that human reality as the center of the work. The way efficiency had been allowed to become the primary value when efficiency was, at best, the 3rd or 4th most important value in a place where people arrived frightened and sick and needing something that no procedure manual had ever adequately described. He had said this at various points to various people in various institutions and had been received with the specific combination of agreement in principle and resistance in practice that characterized institutional medicine in the 1960s. People agreed with him. They continued doing what they were doing. So he had built something different. Kellerman Memorial in 1971 was not, by the standards of the time, a large or well-funded institution. It had been built on a combination of a substantial personal loan, a grant from a foundation whose board Henley had spent 2 years cultivating, and the donated labor of a group of physicians and nurses and administrators who had heard what he was trying to do and had decided it was worth trying. The building was modest. The equipment was adequate rather than excellent. The staff was small. What was not modest was the culture. Henley had been specific about this too. The culture was the thing that couldn't be bought or built with construction loans and foundation grants. The culture had to be established deliberately from the beginning in every decision and every practice and every interaction between the institution and the people who came to it. He had written a document, not a mission statement, something more specific, more operational, describing what Kellerman Memorial was supposed to be. He had given it to every staff member. He had revised it twice in the first year as he learned what he had gotten wrong. He had kept revising it in his own copy for 50 years. He had run the hospital for 22 years. Then he had stepped back, not retired, stepped back, the specific transition of someone who understood that an institution he had built needed to develop an identity that was not entirely dependent on his continued presence. He had served on the board for another 15 years. Then he had resigned from the board too, for the same reason. He had not disappeared. He came back, periodically, in the specific way of someone who had built something and wanted to know that it was still what they had built it to be. He walked the wards. He sat in the waiting rooms. He watched how the staff talked to patients and how the patients responded and whether the thing he had tried to build was still there under the institutional accumulation of the decades. He did not announce himself when he came. He came in the plain coat and the old shoes, and he sat in waiting rooms and he watched. He had been doing this for 30 years. The staff who had been there long enough remembered him. The newer staff didn't know him. The institution he had built had grown large enough that he could move through it without being recognized, which was, he had told his daughter once, the best test of whether it was genuinely the thing he had intended or only a performance of it. If it treated an old man in a plain coat with the same quality of care it would give anyone else, it was real. If it only treated him well when it knew who he was, it was not. He had been running this test for 30 years. He had not planned to run it on his last night. The nurse's name was Christine Park. She had been at Kellerman Memorial for 11 years, which was long enough to have heard the stories about the founder, but not long enough to have any direct experience of him. She was 38 years old in the emergency department, and she had been finishing the paperwork on a discharged patient when she looked through the window and saw the old man at the entrance. She recognized him from a photograph. Not a prominent photograph. A small framed print in the corridor outside the administrative wing on the 3rd floor, part of a series of historical images that chronicled the hospital's founding. She passed it regularly and had looked at it, properly looked at it, once, about 2 years ago, when she had been passing slowly enough to read the caption. The photograph showed a young man, 31 years old, in 1971, standing outside the original building on the day it opened. He was not looking at the camera. He was looking at the building. The expression on his face was the expression of someone who has been working towards something for a long time and is now standing in front of it and is trying to understand that it is real. She had thought, looking at the photograph 2 years ago, that's what it looks like to have built something. She had not expected to see that face again, 50 years older, in a worn grey coat, standing at the entrance at 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. But she recognized it, the specific bone structure, the way he held his head, something about the quality of his stillness. She was out of the department and through the corridor and through the doors before she had fully formulated the thought. Running on the recognition, on the specific alarm that had fired when she saw the color of his face change through the glass. She had been right about the color. He was alive. That was the first thing she confirmed, the moment she had his arm in both hands. Alive, conscious, able to speak. "I think I waited a little too long," he said. She said, "We're going to fix that. Come with me." They got him inside and onto a gurney in 6 minutes. The cardiac team had been paged before they reached the bay. Dr. Sarah Voss, the emergency attending, the same Dr. Voss who had been in Bay 3 when Eleanor Vance had walked through the door, was already there. She assessed him quickly. His vital signs were concerning. His color was poor. He was cooperative and clear-minded, which was something. There was no confusion, no altered consciousness. He knew where he was. He knew what was happening. He said to the room in general, "I've been here before, from the other side. It's different from this side." Voss said, "When were you here before?" He said, "I ran this hospital for 22 years. She looked at him, at the worn coat being removed by the nurse, at the plain shirt underneath, at the old shoes, at the man who looked, in every visible way, like someone who had wandered in from the street. She said, 'What's your name?' He said, 'Arthur Henley.'" Voss stood completely still for 1 second. Then she continued working. Because the work was the work regardless of who was on the gurney, which was something he had written in the document she had been given when she started at Kellerman Memorial 11 years ago. But she registered it. The name connected to the photograph on the 3rd floor corridor, connected to the document that every staff member received on their first day, connected to the specific quality of what Kellerman Memorial was that she had noticed when she arrived from her previous hospital and had thought, "This place is different. Something about this place is different." She knew now what the something was. It was standing in the document. It was in every decision the institution made about how to treat the people who came through its doors. And it had come through its own doors tonight in a worn grey coat, and had been guided backward 2 steps by a guard who didn't know who he was. She kept working. The guard came to find Christine Park at 11:30. His name was Marcus Webb, not the Marcus Webb from Veterans Park, a different man entirely, 26 years old, 18 months into his first job, a person who had been doing his job correctly by the parameters available to him, and who had been told in the last 2 hours what those parameters had missed. He stood in the corridor outside Bay 3 and said, "Is he going to be okay?" Christine said, "They think so. We got to it in time." He said, "Because of you. Because you saw him." She said, "Yes." He said nothing for a moment. She said, "You didn't do anything wrong. You didn't know." He said, "I put my hands on him." She said, "You were doing your job. The parameters for your job didn't include information about who he was." He said, "Should they?" She thought about this. About the specific question of whether a security guard at a hospital entrance should have a photograph or a list or some form of information that would prevent him from guiding a founder backward by the shoulders. About whether the institutional solution to what had happened tonight was informational. She said, "Maybe, but that's not the real answer." He said, "What's the real answer?" She said, "The real answer is what he built this hospital to be, which is a place where an old man in a worn coat is treated the same way regardless of who he is. He didn't want anyone to be guided backward 2 steps. He didn't want the special treatment either. He wanted the same treatment for everyone, the right treatment for everyone." He said, "I didn't give him the right treatment." She said, "No, you gave him the standard treatment for someone presenting as a problem to be managed. And he was not a problem to be managed. He was a person who needed to come in. That's the distinction. That's the thing this hospital was built around." She said, "He walks the wards sometimes, you know, in that coat, watches how we treat people, has been doing it for 30 years. We just passed his test without knowing we were taking it." He said, "Did we pass?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I got to him in time. Yes, I think we passed." Dr. Henley was stabilized by midnight. The cardiac event, an acute myocardial infarction, the kind that announces itself loudly enough that waiting becomes dangerous, had been caught at a stage where intervention was possible. He would require surgery, the cardiologist told his daughter when she arrived at 1 a.m., but the prognosis was good. He had been lucky in his timing. His daughter, a woman in her late 50s named Elizabeth, who had the same quality of stillness as her father, and who had been called at 10:15 by a hospital administrator who had recognized the name, sat beside his bed in the bay and looked at him for a long time before she said anything. She said, "You drove yourself here." He said, "It seemed efficient." She said, "You drove yourself to the hospital you built, in the middle of the night, alone, while having a heart attack." He said, "I didn't know it was a heart attack until I got here." She said, "What did you think it was?" He said, "I thought it was something that needed medical attention. I made a reasonable assessment and acted on it." She said, "You could have called an ambulance." He said, "I considered it, but I wanted to see—" He stopped. She said, "Wanted to see what?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the bay around him, at the equipment and the staff visible through the glass, at the organized, purposeful activity of a hospital emergency department at midnight. He said, "I wanted to see if it was still what I built it to be, one last time, from the right side of it." Elizabeth looked at him. She had been his daughter for 58 years, and she had a particular understanding of the way he thought that came from that duration and from being, in many ways, very like him. She said, "And?" He said, "The nurse recognized me, not because she was told to, because she was paying attention. She ran. She got to me before—" He paused. "It's still the thing I built it to be. The recognition was not the point. The running was the point." He said, "The guard didn't know. He did what he was supposed to do with the information he had, and then the system worked around his gap. That's what I wanted. Not a guard who knew my face. A system that was resilient enough to work even when the guard didn't know my face." Elizabeth said, "The system almost didn't work." He said, "Yes, 30 seconds, but it did work. The nurse ran." He closed his eyes. Not in distress, in the specific exhaustion of someone who has been managing something difficult and has been permitted to stop managing it. He said, "The document, the one I wrote, is it still in use?" Elizabeth said, "Every new staff member gets it on the first day." He said, "Has it changed?" She said, "It's been added to. There are 3 supplementary sections. The original is still there." He said, "Good." He was quiet. She said, "You should sleep." He said, "I know, I will." He said, "Tell the nurse, Park. Tell her—" He stopped, thought about what he wanted to say. "Tell her that running was the right thing, that it's always the right thing when you see something that needs running toward." Elizabeth said, "I'll tell her." He slept. Christine was still on shift when Elizabeth found her. She had been told, by this point, the full context. Who Dr. Henley was, what he had built, the 30 years of walking the wards in the plain coat. She had sat with this information for 2 hours and had done the work of integrating it with what she had witnessed. Elizabeth said, "He wanted me to tell you something." Christine listened. She said, "Tell him I know. That's what this place was built to produce, someone running." Elizabeth looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "You've read the document." Christine said, "Every word, when I started, and twice since." Elizabeth said, "What do you remember from it?" Christine thought about it. The specific language of a document she had read carefully enough to have absorbed rather than simply processed. She said, "The part about the person at the door. He wrote that the most important moment in a patient's experience of this institution is the first 30 seconds after they come through the door, not the diagnosis, not the treatment, the first 30 seconds. Because that's when they learn whether they are in a place that sees them as a person or a place that sees them as a problem." She said, He built an entire hospital around those 30 seconds. Elizabeth said, "Yes." Christine said, "Tonight he was outside the door for 1 minute and 47 seconds. I counted afterward, looking at the security footage. He was there for 1 minute and 47 seconds, and he was guided backward 2 steps, and then I saw him through the window." She said, "He was there for 1 minute and 47 seconds, and the first 30 seconds failed, and then it recovered, and he's alive." Elizabeth said nothing. Christine said, "He's right that the system worked. But 1 minute and 47 seconds is not 30 seconds. The gap between what he built and what happened tonight is 1 minute and 17 seconds. Elizabeth said, "Yes." Christine said, "That's what I'm going to fix." She said it in the way that people say things they mean, with the specific quality of someone who has identified a problem and has the standing and the will to address it. Elizabeth looked at her, at the nurse who had run through the corridor at 9:47 p.m. She said, "He's going to want to know what you do." Christine said, "Tell him I'll report back." She started the following week. Not with new procedures. Procedures were not the problem. The guard had followed the correct procedure for someone presenting as an unauthorized visitor after hours. The problem was not procedural. The problem was that the procedure was calibrated to the security function and not to the care function, and the two functions had been allowed to operate in silos without sufficient coordination. She convened a meeting. Emergency department charge nurses, security supervisors, the patient experience coordinator, the director of nursing. She described what had happened, not dramatically, accurately, with the specific precision of someone who had been running through a corridor at 9:47 p.m. and had been replaying the 1 minute and 47 seconds ever since. She said, "This building was designed around the first 30 seconds. The founder wrote that the first 30 seconds determine whether a person experiences this institution as a place that sees them or a place that processes them. Last Tuesday, the first 30 seconds failed. Not because of a bad actor, not because of malice, because two systems, security and care, were operating in parallel without sufficient communication, and a person in acute distress fell into the gap between them." She said, "I want to close the gap." The meeting was 3 hours. The outcome was a specific set of changes to the handoff protocols between security and emergency reception, not more rules, better communication. A direct channel between the entrance security station and the emergency department triage desk. A specific training module on the recognition of distress indicators in patients who present as something other than patients. A review of the first 30 seconds that was now going to happen formally, quarterly, rather than being assumed. Not revolutionary changes, operational ones, the kind that closed specific gaps rather than reinventing existing systems. She documented everything and sent it to hospital administration. She also sent a copy to Elizabeth Henley with a note. "Here is the report." Elizabeth replied, "He will be very pleased." Dr. Henley had the surgery on Thursday. It went well. He was in recovery by noon, the surgical team using language that translated, through the specific filtering of medical communication, into, "This should not have been possible, given everything, but here we are." He was awake by late afternoon. He was, his daughter said, already asking questions, not about his condition, about the hospital, about what had changed since Tuesday, about what Christine Park had done. Elizabeth showed him the documentation. He read it in the specific way he read everything, completely before responding. He read the handoff protocol changes. He read the training module outline. He read the first 30 seconds review framework. He said, "She identified the gap precisely." Elizabeth said, "Yes." He said, "The gap was not what I thought it was." She said, "What did you think it was?" He said, "I thought the gap was recognition. I thought the problem was that the guard didn't know who I was. But that's not the right framing. The right framing is what Park identified, the two systems operating without communication. That's fixable." What I thought was the problem wasn't fixable without the kind of special treatment I specifically didn't want. He said, "She found a better solution than I would have found." Elizabeth said, "You want to tell her that yourself?" He said, "When I'm out of here." He said, "Which will be as soon as they'll let me go." He was discharged 11 days after admission. He did not go home immediately. He went to the hospital. Not through the main entrance, through the side entrance that the staff used, which had been showed to him by Christine Park, who had been told he was coming and had met him at the door. He was thinner than he had been. He moved more carefully, but the pale grey eyes were the same, and the quality of attention was the same, and the specific way he looked at the hospital around him as they walked through it was the same. He walked through the emergency department. He looked at the triage desk and the new direct line to the security station. He looked at the training materials Christine had developed. He walked through the ward he had built in 1971, which was now a wing that bore only a structural relationship to the original, but which had, it seemed to him, kept the thing he had been trying to build. He walked through the corridor on the 3rd floor. He stopped in front of the photograph. A young man, 31 years old, in 1971, standing outside the original building, looking at the building. The expression of someone who has been working towards something for a long time and is now standing in front of it. He looked at the photograph for a long time. He said to Christine, who was standing beside him, "I didn't know, when this was taken, whether it would become the thing I wanted it to be. You can't know that. You can build the structure and establish the culture and write the document and make the decisions, and then you have to let it go and see what it becomes." He said, "It became this, which is better than I dared to build it to be." Christine said, "Because of what you built it to be." He said, "Because of the people who built it forward. That's what institutions are. You build the beginning. The people build what comes after." He looked at the photograph for another moment. Then he said, "Show me the first 30 seconds." She walked him to the entrance, to the place where he had stood on Tuesday night, in the worn grey coat, in the minute and 47 seconds before she had come through the door. They stood there together. He looked at the entrance, at the security desk and the triage desk with their new direct line, at the emergency department visible beyond. He said, "Better." She said, "Not perfect yet." He said, "No, but better, and better is the direction." He said, "Keep going in the direction." He left. He walked to his daughter's car, where she was waiting. He got in slowly, carefully, the movements of someone who had recently been reminded of the specific fragility of the body. He did not look back at the entrance. He had seen what he came to see. Christine Park became the director of emergency nursing at Kellerman Memorial 3 years later. The appointment was made by an administration that had watched over 3 years the specific quality of what she had done with the first 30 seconds work. Not just the protocol changes, but the ongoing attention, the quarterly reviews, the continuous examination of the gap between what the institution was supposed to be and what it was on any given day. She framed the appointment letter, not because of the appointment, because of the letter that came with it, signed by the board chair, which described the reason for the selection. The letter said, "Her understanding of what this institution was built to be, and her commitment to closing the gap between that intention and daily practice." The gap. The specific language she had used in the meeting the week after Dr. Henley's admission. She kept looking at the gap. She kept closing it, incrementally, the way that durable improvements are made, not through dramatic intervention, but through the continuous attention of someone who has decided that the gap matters and is going to keep working on it. She walked the hospital the way he had walked it, not in a plain coat. She was recognizable, her role visible, which meant she was testing something different. She was testing whether the culture held up under observation as well as it held up unobserved. Mostly it did. Sometimes it didn't. When it didn't, she closed the gap. She kept the document, his document, the one he had written in 1971. It was still given to every new staff member on their first day. She had added a section of her own in the most recent revision, not replacing anything he had written, adding to it. Her section was about the entrance, about the first 30 seconds, about 1 minute and 47 seconds on a Tuesday night in November, and a nurse who ran and what the running was for. She described it precisely, what had been in the gap, what she had done, what had changed. She ended it. The first 30 seconds are the whole thing. Everything after them is medicine. The 30 seconds are whether this is a place that sees people or a place that processes them. Build them correctly. Fix them when they fail. Keep fixing them because they will fail again, and the failure is always recoverable if you catch it. She kept catching it. That was the job. That was what he had built it to be. She kept it going. Have you ever been in a place that made you feel like a person rather than a problem? Have you ever been the person who ran towards something when it would have been easier not to? Drop your story in the comments. And if you believe that some institutions are built around a single human truth and spend their entire existence trying to live up to it, subscribe. There are more stories like this one, more worn grey coats, more first 30 seconds, more nurses who run toward, always. End of story. The Founder. 50,000 characters. Original work. Dr. Henley came back to the hospital one more time. Not to walk the wards. He had walked them enough, he said. Not to check on the first 30 seconds. Christine was doing that. Had been doing it for 3 years. Would continue doing it. He came back because Elizabeth had asked him to. Because there was a ceremony. Small. The kind that institutions hold when they want to acknowledge something without making it into a performance. And he had agreed to attend. Not because he wanted the acknowledgement. Because he had something to say, and this was the occasion to say it. The ceremony was in the conference room on the 2nd floor. Staff from the emergency department, administration, nursing leadership. 20, perhaps 25 people. The kind of number that fits in a conference room without formality. Christine was there. The guard, Marcus Webb, was there. The cardiologist who had operated. The nurses who had been in Bay 3 that night. Dr. Voss, who had been the attending and who had kept working after she heard the name and had thought about that choice for 3 years. Dr. Henley stood at the front of the room in a plain jacket and dark trousers and shoes that were old but polished. He was thinner than he had been. He moved carefully, but the pale grey eyes were the same. He said, "I want to tell you something about why I built this hospital. Not the institutional version. I've said that many times and it's in the document and you've all read the document. Something more personal." He said, "In 1965, I was a resident at a hospital that was technically excellent. The medicine was good. The procedures were correct. And I watched a man sit in a waiting room for 4 hours in the specific distress of someone who is afraid and in pain and does not know whether anyone is going to come. And when someone finally came, they processed him efficiently and correctly. And the efficiency was a kind of contempt, not intentional, but real. And I thought, that is not what this work is supposed to be." He said, "I spent 6 years thinking about what it was supposed to be, and then I built this." He looked at the room. He said, "On the night I came here in November, the guard did what the procedure required. He managed a situation correctly by the parameters available to him. And the nurse ran, and the running was the thing this hospital was built for." He looked at Christine. He said, "I want you to know that the 1 minute and 47 seconds you identified, the gap between the first 30 seconds and the actual response, that gap will never be fully closed. Not because of failure of will or failure of system, because the people who come through that door arrive in infinite variety at infinite times with infinite combinations of circumstances, and no system can anticipate all of them. There will always be gaps." He said, "What you can do is what you've been doing. Close the gaps you find, build the culture that makes the running possible, and trust that the next person who runs will get there." He said, "That's what I built. Not a system that had no gaps. a culture that ran toward the gaps. He looked at the guard. He said, "You did your job. I want you to know that. The job needed to change, and it has changed thanks to the work that's been done here. But the person doing the job was doing it correctly. The gap was in the design, not in you." Marcus Webb said nothing, but something in his posture changed, a specific release of something he had been carrying. Henley said, "The night I drove here, I knew something was wrong. I knew it for perhaps 2 hours before I decided to come. I waited too long, which is typical of people who build hospitals. We believe in medicine until we personally need it." He smiled. The room laughed carefully, the way rooms laugh when the person making the joke has recently had cardiac surgery. He said, "I drove here because I wanted to see, one last time, whether it was still the thing I built." He said, "It is. It's more than the thing I built. You took what I started, and you built it forward in ways I didn't anticipate, and in some ways I couldn't have. That's what institutions are supposed to do." He said, "I'm not going to walk the wards anymore. I'm done with that. I've seen enough. I know what this place is." He said, "Take care of it." He sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then the department chief started to applaud, and the room joined her, and Dr. Henley sat in the chair at the front of the conference room and received it with the specific quality he brought to everything. Complete, without performance, the way he had run this hospital for 22 years and built it for the years before that and walked it for the 30 years since. Afterward, in the corridor, Christine found him. She said, "The document, the one you wrote in 1971, I added a section." He said, "Elizabeth told me, I read it." She said, "Is it right?" He said, "It's right. It's more precise than what I wrote in that section," which is correct. "You had 50 years of practice to draw on." She said, "I had what you built to draw on?" He said, "Yes, that's how it's supposed to work." He started toward the elevator. Stopped. He said, "The first 30 seconds. You understand now why I built everything around them?" She said, "Yes." He said, "The medicine saves the body. The first 30 seconds save the person. Both are necessary. The medicine without the 30 seconds is technically correct and humanly insufficient. The same medicine, done in a place that sees you rather than processes you, is different medicine. Not because the procedure changes, because the person receiving it is in a different state when they receive it." He said, "That's what I spent 50 years trying to explain. I'm not sure I ever said it that clearly until just now." She said, "I'll add it to the document." He said, "Good." He got in the elevator. The doors closed. She stood in the corridor for a moment, then she went back to work. The document was revised the following month. Christine made 2 additions, the section she had already added about the first 30 seconds, and now this. The medicine saves the body. The first 30 seconds save the person. Both are necessary. She sent the revised document to the printer. It went to every new staff member starting the following Monday. She thought about the night in November, about 9:47 p.m. and a worn grey coat and 1 minute and 47 seconds, about the specific calculation of 30 seconds versus 1 minute and 47, and what the difference cost and what it nearly cost and what it had in fact cost in the gap that still existed between the institution's intention and its practice. She thought about running, about the specific decision, not a decision, not in the thinking sense, something faster than thinking, to go through the door. About what it felt like to run toward something when you were not entirely certain what you were running toward. About what it felt like to be right. She thought about Dr. Henley in the conference room, the pale grey eyes and the plain jacket and the 50 years of building something and watching it build itself forward. The specific quality of someone who had made something and had the patience to let the making continue without him. She walked through the emergency department on her way back to her office. She passed the triage desk. She looked at the direct line to the security station, the small operational change that had closed a specific gap. She looked at the entrance doors. The first 30 seconds. A patient was coming through the door. An older woman, moving carefully, a family member beside her. The triage nurse was already moving toward them, moving fast, not running, but fast. The specific movement of someone who has been trained to reach people quickly, who understands what the first 30 seconds are for. The older woman saw the nurse coming and her face changed. Not relief exactly, something prior to relief. The specific change that occurs when a person understands they are in a place that sees them. Christine watched for a moment. Then she went to her office. She had work to do. She kept doing it. Every day, every shift, every first 30 seconds. The gap between intention and practice was never zero. It never would be, but it was smaller than it had been, and it was getting smaller, and the direction of travel was the right direction. That was what he had built. Not a finished thing, a direction. She kept going in the direction. Marcus Webb put in for a transfer 3 months after the ceremony, not away from Kellerman Memorial, to a different role within it. The patient experience team had been expanded as part of Christine's restructuring work, and one of the new roles was specifically at the entrance. Not security, not triage, but a specific welcoming function designed to close the gap in the first 30 seconds. Someone whose job was to see the people coming through the door before they reached any other system. He applied. He was selected. He started in January. The role was not dramatic. He stood near the entrance during the high traffic hours, and he looked at the people coming in. He learned, over the first 2 months, to see what Christine and Dr. Henley and 30 years of the institution had been describing. The difference between a person who was okay and a person who needed someone to move quickly toward them. The difference was subtle. It was in the color of a face, the quality of movement, the specific way someone's hand was positioned, the thing that the body showed before the person was ready to show it. He got better at seeing it. He did not get perfect at it. No one was. But he got better, and better was the direction, and he kept going in the direction. Christine checked in with him monthly. She asked the same question each time. What did you see this month that you didn't see the month before? He always had an answer. The quality of the answers improved over time. In April, he saw something. An older man, 60s, moving through the entrance with the specific quality that he had learned to recognize. Not quite right. Something in the color and the movement and the hand position that said, this person needs someone to move toward them right now. He moved. He was beside the man in 5 seconds. He said, "Are you okay? Can I help you?" The man looked at him, said, "I don't know. Something's wrong." Webb said, "Come with me." He got him to triage. The triage nurse assessed immediately. Cardiac. Bay 3, fast. Webb stood in the corridor afterward. He thought about November, about a worn grey coat and a minute and 47 seconds, about the thing he had done wrong and the thing he had done right and the specific distance between the two. He had moved in 5 seconds. He went back to the entrance. Christine heard about it from the triage nurse. She found Webb at the end of his shift. She said, "I heard about the man this afternoon." He said, "I saw it." "I don't know how I saw it, but I saw it." She said, "Because you've been learning to see it for 4 months." He said, "It felt different from November. In November I was doing a procedure. Today I was doing—" He stopped. "I don't know what to call it." She said, "The thing the hospital was built for." He said, "Yes." She said, "That's the first 30 seconds. That's what you did." He said, "Dr. Henley would have wanted to know about it." She said, "I'll tell him." She did tell him, through Elizabeth, who visited weekly and who relayed specific stories from the hospital that he had asked to be kept informed about. Elizabeth called her the following day. She said, "He listened to the whole thing. Then he said, 'The guard ran. Tell her the guard ran.'" Christine said, "Yes, the guard ran." Elizabeth said, "He's pleased." Christine said, "Good." Dr. Henley died in September. 11 months after the night in November. Not at the hospital. At home, in the early morning, quietly, in the way that people who have done significant things sometimes go, as if the significance had been completed and the continuation was simply the body catching up. Elizabeth called Christine. The hospital held a gathering. Not a formal ceremony, a gathering which was more accurate for what the staff wanted to do. They gathered in the emergency department, which was where it had happened, which was where the running had been. They stood in the space between the entrance and Bay 3, and they said what they wanted to say, the people who had been there in November and the people who had come after. Marcus Webb was there. He stood near the entrance, near the place where he had put his hands on the founder's shoulders and guided him backward 2 steps, and he stood there with the specific quality of someone who had been carrying something and had been given something else to carry instead. Christine spoke. She read the section of the document that Dr. Henley had written in 1971, the original section about the first 30 seconds. Then she read the section she had added. Then she read the sentence he had said in the corridor. The medicine saves the body. The first 30 seconds save the person, which was now in the document and would be given to every new staff member and would be there when she was gone and when the people who came after her were gone, and the institution continued in the direction he had built it. She said, "He walked these wards for 30 years in a worn coat so we wouldn't know who he was, because he wanted to know whether the thing he built was real or just a performance. He found out finally on the last night he came. It was real." She said, "It's our job to keep it real." The gathering ended. The emergency department continued its work. The doors opened and closed. People came through them in infinite variety, at various hours, with various degrees of distress. The staff moved toward them, quickly, with the specific quality of people who understood what the first 30 seconds were for. The gap between intention and practice was smaller than it had been. It would shrink further. It would never reach 0. But it was going in the right direction. Christine went back to work. She kept going in the direction. Every day, every shift, every first 30 seconds. That was the job. That was what he had built it to be. She kept it going. The document was updated one final time in October, a month after Dr. Henley died. Christine wrote the last section herself, not about the first 30 seconds. That had been written. About what happened after the 30 seconds, about the 11 months between November and September, and what they had contained. She wrote about the protocol changes and the training module and the quarterly reviews. She wrote about Marcus Webb and the 5 seconds in April. She wrote about the cardiologist who had kept working after she heard the name. She wrote about Dr. Voss, who had been in Bay 3 that night and who had thought about the choice to keep working for 3 years and had told Christine once that she had thought about it specifically because it was the right thing to do, and she had wanted to understand why it felt necessary to think about something that was right. She wrote, "The test is not whether you treat people correctly when you know who they are. The test is whether you treat people correctly when you don't. Dr. Henley spent 30 years walking these wards in a worn coat so that he could watch us take the test. He passed us in November, 11 months before he died. That passing was earned by everyone in this building who had been doing the work correctly before they knew he was watching." She wrote, "This institution was built around a truth. The truth is that the people who come through that door are not problems to be managed. They are people who need something. The work is to see them, to run toward them, to give them the first 30 seconds correctly, and then to give them everything after." She sent the document to the printer. She put it on her desk and looked at it for a moment. A document written in 1971 by a 31-year-old man standing outside a building he had just built, looking at it with the expression of someone who had been working towards something for a long time. Revised twice in the first year. Revised again, periodically, over 50 years. 4 sections of additions, the last one written by a nurse who had run through a corridor at 9:47 p.m. and had been right to run. The document was the institution. Everything else, the building, the equipment, the procedures, the staff, was the container for the document. The document was the thing that made it what it was. She closed the document. She went to the entrance. She stood there for a moment, at the place where it happened, at the first 30 seconds. The doors opened. A woman came through, moving carefully, a man beside her holding her arm. Christine moved toward them, fast. She said, "I've got you. Come with me." The woman looked at her. The specific change, not relief, something prior to relief, being seen. Christine took her arm and walked her to triage. That was the job. She kept doing it. Every day, every shift, every first 30 seconds. The document would outlast her. The institution would outlast her. The first 30 seconds would be given to every new staff member, and they would read it, and some of them would understand it immediately, and some of them would understand it later, and all of them would be in a place that had been built around the understanding. That was what he had built. That was what she was keeping. She went back to work. The doors opened and closed. People came through. The staff moved toward them. The gap between intention and practice was smaller than it had been the year before. It would be smaller still the year after. That was the direction. She kept going in it.